Good. Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me, and James and Alicia for putting this great series together. I think the Integrity Office is a really fantastic initiative, and I hope it keeps going. I think it's going from strength to strength, given the number of people on the call. And I was very privileged to speak, I think, a couple of years ago, actually on qualitative data and ethics. So I'm really glad that this is kind of recycling with new ideas, and that there's such a broad range of issues being covered by you. So thank you very much. Just a little bit about my background, just so you can know where I'm coming from. I'm one of the directors at the UK Data Archive, and I've had about 30 years in data sharing, archiving, governance, starting off really with working on the design of the British Household Panel Study, a very large longitudinal study, predominantly quantitative, where I got involved in some of the methodology there, and also thinking about participation, incentives, all those sorts of things. I then moved on in the early 90s to set up the Qualidata, the Qualitative Data Archive, which was the first kind of national qualitative archiving project in the world. And we pioneered their kind of archiving and sharing methods. And Libby Bishop was one of my staff, and I kindly lent her to Timescapes, and she went off and did a wonderful job to work with the colleagues to set up a really powerful archive. So it's really nice. And obviously grappling with issues of consent, ethics, around the difficult areas of sharing that's often, you know, going to be personal data, very hard to anonymize, and does need to be treated as personal data. So the last 20 years I've been working more broadly across data archiving, sharing, on licensing, governance, and the last couple of years I've been really focusing down on controlled data, on personal data, quantitative data that's used in safe havens. That's my kind of current research interest. So I'm going to tell you about what I know there, and I think some of the fantastic protocols and frameworks those services have in place to deal with ethical issues and GDPR. So I think it's a very powerful model that hopefully we can all go on to use in other circumstances. So moving on to the next slide. So just a bit about my service. It's been going for about 55 years. It's got a very long history. It's one of the first kind of archives of research data in the UK, and a lot of protocols have been built around that and off that. Mostly social science data, but increasingly biomedical data, and other kinds of things that are of interest to the social scientists, which isn't necessarily just collecting data from people. It could be the context around, you know, the ways that they live. It curates and is a data stewards data for research and teaching. It has its trusted digital repository status, which means it looks after data according to the kind of information security protocols, and also that data will be long lasting and live forever. So it has migration strategies as well. We've recently become a digital economy app processor, and I'm going to tell you really about that in this talk, because I think it's a really interesting avenue. And obviously there's been a lot of close working with research funders, key data producers, to make sure the right kinds of data are coming in, and to make sure they're fair, that they can be reusable in years to come. There's about 8,000 collections that we deal with, from open access to secure and lockdown, and that covers quite a wide range of data as well. So obviously our main collection really is based around the social surveys. Some of the collections are time series of surveys carried out by central government that go back to the 1960s. Things like Health Saver for England, Family Resources Survey. We have all of those data sets, and including some of the legacy ones from the 60s that I don't think exist anywhere else. So they're very powerful sets of data. And we are very fortunate in the UK that we have really rapid data collection and made available for research purposes around 6 months after it's kind of been put together. So we're very privileged in the UK that we have free at the point access from wonderful data producers. We have the great cohort studies, the longitudinal studies as well that are available. Quite a lot of qualitative data. I think there's about 1,500 qualitative data collections that come in from people who've had research grants, and some much larger projects as well. We have some of the Timescapes data that can be shared. There's aggregate data sources and quite a few historical databases, some going back, covering 12th century issues and digitized sources. So it's quite a wide variety, and our staff support all of those things. Just to say, the spectrum of access that we've used for some time, and I think it's now gaining popularity, is to help classify our data into one of these buckets, if that's possible. Open absolutely no risk of identification or upsetting anyone. Generally, probably aggregated data, not particularly useful for research maybe, but still very useful for teaching, training and learning. Safeguard is this middle category where there may be some risk of identification of people or places or businesses, but it has a number of safeguards in place to protect that, and that Catherine and Anna talked about that, you know, having these safeguards that make sure that we are protecting those and they're compliant with GDPR to make sure the safeguards are strong enough to deal with the risk. And that's a fine game to play. It's a fine balance trying to do that. That requires some level of authentication and authorization to get in, and an audit trail as well. Now, the controlled data sources really do pose a risk of personal identification. They are where people or businesses, places can be identified, and therefore we need to put in place legal gateways to use this. Otherwise, we are potentially breaking the law. So that requires, again, authentication, authorization, and there's a whole host of added safeguards that are really useful, and obviously they have ethical components to them as well. So I'm going to take you through those. A little bit about reduction in risk. That's what we're looking at. If we want to treat a data set that comes to us as an archivist, we can try and anonymize it, pseudonymize it, and make it available. But once we do that, you know, we destroy some of the some important the important kind of information that I think, as our previous speakers are talking about, that once you lose that, you lose the essence of the study, and it's actually then really hard for someone to reuse that. So it's a very fine balance, but we need to make sure the data owners are happy with what we're doing, and it's always a discussion around what they're prepared to accept as risk and what they want to put in place to mitigate the risk. And as I said before, they may have different safeguards that they want to use, and there may be different legal gateways, which makes it difficult for data owners sometimes. It's much easier, I think, if you're in a government domain, government departments, National Health Service. They do have accepted protocols and legal gateways that are very clear. But I think, you know, the GDPR is the gateway used in academia, but it's still, I think, quite a I think people are very unsure about how to work with it. And again, we saw from Catherine and Anna that it's an ongoing, it's kind of ongoing planning process. It's not always that clear to get it absolutely kind of straightforward. So we use the 5 SAVES framework, which offers a really nice portfolio of safeguards to help us mitigate against these risks. Yes, so we talked about legal gateways. Many of them have different legal restrictions placed on their data, but ideally in the UK, we're very good at realising that data can be used for research, and we've done as much as we can in legislation to try and enable that. So we're actually a very forthcoming country in trying to make this happen. It may seem sometimes that it's an impossible task when you're trying to, particularly in the last point, you're trying to link data from different sources, health sources, you know, other kind of survey sources or business sources. It becomes really hard to link data, partly because we don't have any national identifiers, and it often becomes a really difficult linking challenge. And also there's ethical issues around doing that, and multiple legal gateways as well. If any of you have tried to do that will know how long and painful it can be. So just a little bit about the legal gateways before we get into the kind of ethical issues. The Digital Economy Act is what I'm going to talk about. It is a really nice act that's come forward that allows data sharing under particular conditions, and the framework in order to do that is actually very powerful and extensible, I think. The GDPR also is a very powerful gateway, has exemptions for research and can be utilised. I don't see the frameworks that the Digital Economy Act has used put in place yet, but I think they probably could be very easily. There's also a host of other acts, but another one that kind of governs the use of statistical data from central government is the Statistics and Registration Services Act, which allows research under various conditions, but most of the data sets have been, or data sources have been superseded under the Digital Economy Act. So the gateways are normally focusing down on this idea about person specific, and the term bona fide researcher to me is a very vague term, and I've never been particularly keen on it, because it could mean that I'm a professor, so you trust me, I've got a host of publications. But actually, if you look at kind of attributes of a person to use data safely, there's a kind of some attitudinal and behavioural traits in there that I think we need to look at. So this idea of judging what a fit and proper person is, I think it's really important, and the Digital Economy Act's gone a long way to do that beyond this bona fide issue. And the medical profession's very much into using bona fide, but when you challenge them on what it means, they don't really have a particularly nuanced answer. Although I think that's changing because there's more courses that people are asked to do to prove that they are fit and proper. Project specifics, really important. You need to know why you're using the data, what the purposes are. Is that good enough? Does that meet public good or the various demands? Can we be sure that it's really needed? Time specific, again, is this going to be limited? How long do you need this data for? And particularly in GDPR, there's that idea of having limited access to data, or not for being used for very specific purposes. And then, of course, data set specific. There may be gateways that govern particular types of data and particular versions of data sets. So quite often under these acts, a breach of the law is illegal, and that can mean civil as well as criminal sanctions for breaches. So it's taken very seriously. It has to be operationalized really carefully as well, because basically, whether it's a civil servant or a researcher or an archivist, you can be, fined or put in prison for data breaches. So it's really something that we have to take very seriously. So a little bit about the Digital Economy Act. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, and I think it's a fantastic act, and it took a long time coming, but it's a portfolio act. It covers a number of different kind of services, including access to digital services, broadband internet in our country, digital infrastructure, there's online pornography, rulings in there, intellectual property, and importantly, the ability to do digital government. That means actually having the capability of exchanging data between different government departments, which really hasn't been possible before. Really hard in our country to kind of link, social data with benefits data, with schooling data. It hasn't really been the legal gateway to do it at all, and now there is, and I think that's really important. And some of this has been mobilized quickly during times of COVID, where we do need statistics on things to be at hand. So actually, whilst they were developing this act, had a very useful research strand in there that actually means that de-identified data can be used for the purposes of research and the public good, which opens up a whole tranche of opportunities for researchers to work with really detailed government data sources. And what was set up was this code of practice and accreditation to make sure that the data can be distributed and used safely. And that code of practice was approved in 2018. The UK Stats Authority is the accrediting body, and there's an accreditation panel that oversees the accreditation of the processors, that's the people who are handling the data at the point of access, the researchers who are going through the process to use data, and the projects which will have outcomes. Now, the UK Data Archive was accredited as a processor this year, and it was a really involved process we went through, but now we can make data available through this act to researchers. So just an example of the kind of data we have at the Data Archive that falls under this act. This is the quarterly labour force survey that's collected on a quarterly basis. It has a data set that's available to many users under our safeguarded category, which means they need to be registered and authenticated, but they can just go and download it. But there's a version also that has far more granular data, more fine-grained data that researchers can use, and this is made available under this Digital Economy Act. And just to give you an example of what kind of things and attributes are in there, very typical kind of variables that will make data put into the controlled category. And they're all around identification of households and people. So low levels of geography, dates of birth, detailed training qualifications, training, where they've been trained, what kind of courses they've done, details on family, households, household characteristics, number of people in the household, extended family units, which can be very disclosive when you're talking about very large households, because there really aren't that many in the UK. So normally in a safeguarded data set, you would top code number of households to either 6 or 6+, because anything, you've got a 12-person household, that becomes far more disclosive. Detailed industry, employment details, unemployment, accidents at work, questions on national identity, how long people have been in the country, all those things that fall under the GDPR as kind of sensitive data sources. So very powerful data sets, and you can see why economists and sociologists want to use this stuff. So this control data has this, what we use is this 5 safes framework that was developed by the Office of National Statistics about 10 years ago, and we use that in our day-to-day work in our data service. So we run a secure lab that allows people to come in and use these controlled data. Now, the 5 safes, I'll tell you a little bit about them, but they are a really nice framework to cover all those things I talked about in earlier slides. So you can only use data in a particular lockdown environment, and it's quite a high access bar to get in. So you need to have various attributes and skills to be able to get in there. I'm going to mention at the end the issues around reproducibility, because actually this form of research is not really set up for reproducibility very well, because in order to go in and reproduce things, you'd have to pass all these bars to get in to do that. And I'll explain how that might be mitigated a bit later on. So the 5 safes. So first of all, is this an appropriate use of data? And that needs to be judged by various panels. I'll mention that in a minute, but that's called a safe project. How trusty are these researchers? Are that safe people? Does the environment where they're going to use data prevent misuse? That's got a safe setting. Is the data appropriate? And that's safe data. Now, if you have an anonymized open version of data, that's safe. Anything that's controlled with this detailed level of data is unsafe data, crudely. And then, is there a confidentiality risk from the publication? So again, the outputs are going to have a different kind of risk. You can make sure that they're not disclosive. Where the data are disclosive, the outputs should not be disclosive. So it works in a slightly different way. That's a safe output. We can work with these together depending on the nature of the data, and then it becomes a safe use. We've got a nice little example here of how that might work. Here's a kind of an equalizer. If you look at this data ones here, the green, if I've got safe data, that would be an open data set. Our people can be unsafe. We've just got sources available on the internet. It doesn't matter how qualified or robust they are. They can pretty much do what they want with it because it's not risky. Again, they can the use is free and easy. They don't need it in control setting. They can download it onto their MacBooks, and they don't need to control the output. So generally, that's deemed as safe data. If, however, we have this unsafe data, this control data, we need to put these safeguards in place because it becomes unsafe to use it. So we ramp up the people, project, setting, and output protections and safeguards to manage that. So I really like that little device. I think it's quite nice. So who are the processors that can distribute this work? And these are the ones who are going to put these 5 safes into operation. There's about 6 of them so far. That's us in Essex, the ONS, and some of the administrative data research centres in the other countries of the UK. And the accreditation is based on information security, meeting the needs and answering all the questions and demonstrating evidence and capability of the staff and processes to be able to do that. There's also accredited researchers, and these are published on the Statistics Authority website, but basically there is a safe researcher training course that's about 3 to 4 hours that they have to do. There's a test they have to pass. That's I've just gone through this after all these years. I thought I better get my accredited research status. Really hard test, even though I know all this stuff and understand it. It's one of those things that you think, I'm not sure. But it's a very, very good test. And then there's an application around why you're fit and proper, what statistical expertise you have, all those sorts of things. Then there needs to be an understanding of disclosure risk and the production of safe outputs, and that's included in the trainings. What is a safe output? Is it, depending if it's a table or a regression estimate or something, what does that mean and how do I do it? And then this attitudinal component about making sure that you understand why it's so important, like not to share data or someone to look at your screen, because if you do, that becomes difficult. So the last part's the project, and this is where we are actually getting to ethics. Although even the safe person, there's an ethical duty to behave well, but the projects are really important, and this is where they're judged for kind of public good and ethics as well. So a researcher fills out a project. There's quite a detailed 5-page application form, and then this goes to this research accreditation panel that's an independent. It has the national statistician on it. It has a number of different independent people on there, and they decide whether this should go forward for exploitation. So just an example there, the UK Statistics Authority have got some really fantastic guidance on how one should fill this in. And this just is an example on the question on methodology. You need to provide details of the protocol and methodology, and it's saying really what you need to do in that in order for this to get through. So you need enough information on the modelling, or justifying why you need that particular data, and then explaining how your methodological approach will then answer the questions that you have. And our service provides a triage of these, and quite a lot have to go back to the researcher to think about doing them a little bit more expertly. And clearly a PhD is probably not going to have quite as much expertise as doing this, almost like writing a grant, as a very experienced professor. The public good element's really important. This is one of the key factors in judging, is that you need to actually consider the wider impact of the research outputs. How are they going to be used? Why are they useful? How are they going to help the public good? And there's a number of different kind of aspects of public good. And it's really important to know where the references are going to be published and what's going to happen. So that's a very important component that's judged. Now, the ethics side I'm going to get to. Quite often, as part of the project, you have to demonstrate ethics compliance, which means you should have gone through, if you're an academic, you should have gone through the research ethics board with your institution. If you're not from a university, if you're from a commercial company or local government, you probably will need to go through what's called the National Statisticians Data Ethics Advisory Committee, and any applications can be considered there if they don't have like REC approval. However, what we found in screening the REC applications is that they're actually not particularly good, and they won't pass the ethics test set by the accreditation board, because most ethics applications are focused on data collection and looking after the data and working with it. When it comes to secondary analysis, they're really quite poorly thought out, and I think that's one thing that the RECs can go off and do, is actually think more carefully really about not just the data collection, but when you're doing secondary analysis, how you need to kind of assess that. So it's definitely a weakness. We've seen really applications that I think actually could be much better, and I think what I'm going to show you next is one way of doing that. So this is the what's called the ethics self-assessment tool. It's been set up by the Stats Authority, and I'm sure some of you know of it already. It is one of the best ethical assessments I've ever seen. I've been in this game a long time, 30 years, working on ethical consent issues. This for me is like the creme de la creme. We should all use it. It's amazing, and the universities would do well to probably use it as well, because it's straightforward to use, and it gives you a judgment on risk at the end of the process. So it's all done via spreadsheets, and it has all these different principles around public good, technologies, legal gateways, engagement, and it's a really very well thought out model. So it's these different elements under each heading. So ethical risk for the project. So at the end, you're going to get a score of ethical risk that the panel can then make a decision upon. And it's around the negative consequences of unethical actions. So that's really what it's looking at. It's actually really operationalizing ethical risk in quite a detailed way. And because there's different kind of ethical decisions have different weights, we've got to think about the kind of the measures that will increase the ethical risk. And that's around obviously use of sensitive data, linkage projects that are linking lots of different sources together, patient level data, research on children, vulnerable adults, and particular kinds of data sources. So they're all taken into consideration when the weighting is done. So what does this tool look like? Well, for each item you get a score. So it goes through the principle and the different areas, and you score what you think. It's a self-assessment. You go through and you score it. Give yourself a RAG code and a score, 1 to 5. And then the spreadsheet will calculate an overall score of your risk level. So it's really a nice tool, and please do go and have a look at it afterwards, because most people we found who filled it in, and when we felt their REC submissions are just not going to cut it, they've gone through and said this is really easy to do. It's very straightforward. It helps me think very carefully about risk and ethics. So yes, I would advocate that as a very powerful tool to use, and it can be used in any circumstances. It doesn't just have to be used for these controlled data sources. It's a free and easy tool that's out there, and I'm really encouraging people to go and have a look at it. So just my last bit really on reproducibility, I think is really important. So clearly when we're looking at public good and risk, And these projects that are going through, they're expensive projects, you know, you've got expensive mechanisms to make them work. The impact's really important. But with these particular safe havens, you can only take out outputs that have been double checked by a team of people who are accredited. So you basically do all your analysis and research inside the environment. You then finish a small chapter or a table or something, and it gets passed to make sure it's not disclosive. And once it's cleared, 2 people look at that who are trained, it comes out and you can use it. The problem is, how do you then, how do you check that table if you've published it in a journal? Well, you've got to go back into the environment and use it. And journals are simply not really ready to do this, and we've had discussions with them, but you're going to need someone who's going to be a reproducer to go back in and replicate within there. Now, at the moment, there needs to be a mechanism to do that, and if somebody was to become an accredited researcher, or was one, then they could actually take on a reproducibility role, but that again isn't really set up as a framework yet, but it could be. What we found inside these labs is that some of the data sets have a very vague provenance chain. Some of them are administrative data. You know, how you go back to step 1 about how they were created, cleaned, versioned, verified is very hard. So absolute reproducibility, I think, is really difficult. But, you know, enough in there to find out what people have done, what data sets they've linked. That's what we'd like to see happening inside these labs. And I'm a really strong proponent of people actually thinking about reproducibility of their code up front within these environments. So the 5 safe, I'm just going to summarize really on the 5 safes network. I think it's a wonderful framework, and I think it's more and more it's being utilized. It was developed by ONS, and I've seen it in use around the world now, so I'm really pleased because I think it's just very straightforward and a powerful message, and quite hard to argue with because it covers all the different components. And I think even for qualitative data, we've been thinking about whether that could be used, but then again, actually checking outputs would be incredibly time consuming, which is why we haven't actually gone for putting qualitative data into our secure lab at the moment, because it would be very difficult to do. We use a rules-based, there's a principle and a rules-based perspective you can use to make sure that the cell counts in tables that are being released are not low, but it would be much harder to do with qual data. Simple ethics assessment, very easy for us to triage, very easy for the decision makers to look at. Accredited researchers, I think, is a really strong idea about having someone who's accredited and trusted to undertake not only the research, but also thinking about reproducibility work as well. There's obviously needs to be extended training on how to be reproducible, and we've seen that through various reproducibility networks, the Turing Centre, so it's all happening. And then, you know, again, encouraging people to be reproducible and think about this, particularly as actually they can't publish their code, and so it's not going to be available in journals. So to think very carefully about having that available inside the safe haven for maybe other researchers to use within there. And not only for reproducibility reasons, but for reuse as well, because people spend hours and hours linking data, manipulating it, you know, difficult data sets. So to have that available in the environment, I think would be really good.